On March 22, 2002, a man walked out of his luxury home in Saint-Sauveur, Quebec, got into one of his expensive vehicles, and drove away. He never came back. His name was Louis Roy, known to most as Melou. He was 47 years old, a self-made millionaire with legitimate businesses scattered across Quebec. He owned bars, restaurants, real estate. He lived in a mansion. He drove luxury cars. By all appearances, he had everything. But Louis Roy had another life. One that existed in the shadows of his success. One that involved criminal networks, dangerous alliances, and men who solved problems with violence. He wasn't just a businessman. He was deeply connected to the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club during one of the most brutal periods in Quebec's history, the biker war that turned streets into battlegrounds and left dozens dead. And then, in the spring of 2002, he vanished. No body, no ransom, no explanation. Just gone. His disappearance came at a time when dozens of people connected to organized crime were being murdered, disappeared, or imprisoned. The Quebec biker war was winding down, but the violence hadn't stopped. Scores were still being settled. Witnesses were being silenced. And people who knew too much were becoming liabilities. Was Louis Roy murdered? Did he run? Did he know something that made him too dangerous to keep alive? Or was there something else, something more personal, more calculated, that led to his disappearance? 23 years later, nobody knows. His family has never received closure. His body has never been found. And the silence surrounding his fate remains as heavy as it was the day he vanished. This is the story of a man who lived between two worlds and disappeared from both. Louis Roy was born in 1954 in Quebec, during a time when the province was on the edge of enormous social change. He grew up in an era that would soon be defined by the Quiet Revolution, a period of rapid secularization, modernization, and cultural assertion. But for young Louis, these grand historical shifts were distant. His world was smaller, more immediate, built on the values of hard work, loyalty, and survival. Those who knew him in his younger years described a man who was charismatic, ambitious, and unafraid to take risks. He wasn't born into wealth, he built it. By his 20s, Louis had already begun establishing himself in the hospitality and entertainment industries. He opened bars. He invested in restaurants. He understood people, understood what they wanted, and more importantly, he knew how to give it to them. By the 1990s, Louis Roy had become a fixture in certain circles across Quebec. He wasn't a household name, but if you moved in the right, or wrong, social spheres, you knew who Melou was. He had money, influence, and connections that extended far beyond the legitimate business world. He was a large man, physically imposing but not threatening in demeanor. People described him as friendly, generous even. He was known to help out friends, to invest in ventures, to show loyalty to those in his circle. But there was always something beneath the surface. A duality. A sense that the man you saw wasn't the whole story. Louis lived well. He owned a beautiful home in Saint-Sauveur, a picturesque town in the Laurentians north of Montreal, known for its ski resorts and wealthy residents. His house was large, modern, filled with the trappings of success. He drove expensive cars. He traveled. He enjoyed the fruits of his labor. But behind this comfortable life was a more dangerous reality. Louis Roy had become deeply enmeshed with the Hells Angels, one of the most powerful and violent criminal organizations in North America. And in Quebec, during the 1990s and early 2000s, being connected to the Hells Angels meant being connected to war. To understand what happened to Louis Roy, you have to understand Quebec in the 1990s. You have to understand the biker war. Because it wasn't just a criminal conflict, it was a full-scale underworld battle that would claim over 160 lives, terrorize communities, and reshape the criminal landscape of an entire province. The conflict began in 1994 and lasted until 2002. On one side were the Hells Angels and their puppet clubs. On the other was the Rock Machine and their allies, including the Bandidos. The war was fought over control of the drug trade, particularly cocaine and marijuana. Quebec was a lucrative market, and both sides wanted dominance. The violence was extraordinary. Car bombs, public executions, Drive-by shootings. People were murdered in restaurants, in parking lots, in their homes. Innocent bystanders were killed. An 11-year-old boy named Daniel Desrochers died in 1995 when a car bomb exploded near him in Montreal. His death shocked the province and intensified public pressure on law enforcement to end the war. But the violence continued. Bodies piled up. Some were found dumped in rivers, burned in cars, or buried in shallow graves. Others simply disappeared, their fates unknown but easily imagined. Louis Roy existed in this world. Not as a biker himself, he was never a patched member of the Hells Angels, but as an associate, a businessman who facilitated operations, who provided services, who moved in the same circles. These were dangerous connections to have, especially as the war intensified and law enforcement began cracking down. By the early 2000s, the Quebec government and police forces had launched Operation Springtime, 2001, a massive coordinated effort to dismantle the Hells Angels and their criminal empire. Hundreds of arrests were made. Major figures were taken off the streets. The organization was crippled, at least temporarily. But even as the war officially wound down, the violence didn't stop. People were still being killed. Debts were still being collected. And those who knew too much, who had been involved in activities that could lead to prosecutions, were becoming liabilities. This was the world Louis Roy inhabited when he disappeared in March 2002. A world where trust was fragile, where yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's threat, and where people vanished all the time. In the months before his disappearance, there were signs that something was wrong in Louis Roy's life. Not obvious warnings, perhaps, but subtle shifts that people close to him noticed. His businesses were doing well, but there were whispers of financial complications. Not bankruptcy or ruin, but issues that needed managing. Some have suggested he owed money to the wrong people. Others have said he was involved in disputes over business deals gone bad. The exact nature of these problems remains unclear, buried in the unspoken world of criminal finance. Behaviorally, Louis seemed normal. He continued his routines, met with business partners, socialized. But some who knew him detected attention. He seemed preoccupied. There were phone calls he took privately, conversations that were brief and serious. Whether Louis knew he was in danger is impossible to say. If he did, he gave no indication that he was planning to flee. He made no arrangements to liquidate assets, no preparations for a sudden departure. His life, from the outside, seemed to be continuing as usual. But beneath the surface, forces were moving. Grudges were being settled. The aftermath of the biker war was still playing out, and Louis Roy was connected to too many dangerous people, knew too many dangerous things. March 2002 was cold. Winter was loosening its grip on Quebec, but the air still carried a chill. Saint-Sauveur, beautiful and quiet, seemed a world away from the violence that had consumed Montreal and other cities during the war. But geography meant nothing when you were connected to the underworld. Distance didn't protect you, isolation didn't save you. And on March 22nd, Louis Roy left his home and vanished. The exact details of that day are frustratingly sparse. What we know is this: Louis Roy was last seen leaving his residence in Saint-Sauveur. He got into a vehicle, sources vary on which of his cars he took, and drove away. Where he was going, who he was meeting, what he planned to do that day, none of this has ever been definitively established. What is certain is that he never came home. When exactly his absence was noticed is unclear from public records. Did someone expect him for a meeting that evening? Was there a phone call that went unanswered? Did a business partner grow concerned when Louis didn't show up at an appointed time? The private nature of his life and the circles he moved in mean that these details remain murky. What we do know is that at some point, people realized Louis Roy was missing. And when you're a man with his connections, in that climate, at that time, a disappearance is rarely innocent. His family was contacted. They hadn't heard from him. His associates were questioned. Nobody had seen him. His vehicles were searched for. His properties were checked. There was no sign of him, no indication of where he might have gone or what might have happened. Unlike many missing person cases, there was no extensive public campaign for Louis Roy. No televised appeals from tearful family members. No posters plastering the streets of Montreal and surrounding areas. The silence was telling. This wasn't the disappearance of an innocent civilian. This was something else. The lack of public outcry doesn't mean his family didn't care. It means they understood the world he was part of. They knew the risks. They knew that making noise could be dangerous. And perhaps they knew that the answers they sought wouldn't come from public attention, but from the dark places where their questions would never be welcome. The police response to Louis Roy's disappearance was immediate but circumscribed. He wasn't just another missing person. He was a person of interest in their ongoing investigations into organized crime. His connections to the Hells Angels meant he was already on their radar. His disappearance was treated as likely foul play from the beginning. But investigating the disappearance of someone deeply embedded in criminal networks presents unique challenges. People don't talk. Witnesses don't come forward. Those who might know something are either too afraid or too complicit to speak. The code of silence in these worlds is absolute. Detectives began with the fundamentals. They traced his last known movements, interviewed people who knew him, examined his financial records, his phone records, his properties. They were looking for anything that might indicate what happened, where he went, who he might have been meeting. What they found were connections, associations, links to people and organizations involved in serious criminal activity. But connections aren't evidence. Associations don't solve murders. And without a body, without witnesses, without concrete proof of a crime, the investigation could only go so far. The prevailing theory among investigators was that Louis Roy had been murdered. The timing of his disappearance, so soon after the massive arrests of Operation Springtime 2001, suggested he might have been killed to prevent him from cooperating with authorities. Perhaps he knew too much about the operations of the Hells Angels. Perhaps he was involved in something that, if revealed, would implicate powerful people. Perhaps he was simply considered a loose end. But there was another possibility that investigators had to consider, that Louis Roy had run. That he knew the walls were closing in, knew he was in danger, and decided to disappear voluntarily. He had the resources, he had the connections. If anyone could vanish and start a new life, it was someone like him. The problem with this theory is the complete absence of preparation. There's no evidence he withdrew large sums of cash, secured false documents, or made any of the arrangements you'd expect from someone planning to flee. His businesses continued to exist. His properties weren't sold. Everything he owned remained where it was, waiting for him to return. Investigators also explored the possibility of personal motives. Was there a dispute with a business partner, a romantic entanglement that went wrong? A debt that became deadly. In the world Louis inhabited, violence could stem from business or from personal grievances, and the two often overlapped. But every lead seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. Theories multiplied, but none could be confirmed. The investigation continued, but with each passing week, month, year, the chances of finding answers diminished. In organized crime circles, when someone disappears, there's usually a reason. And that reason is rarely benign. The Hells Angels, during the period of Louis Roy's disappearance, were under unprecedented pressure. Dozens of members and associates were facing serious charges. Some were cooperating with authorities, others were being eliminated to ensure their silence. Louis Roy's role within this network made him vulnerable in multiple ways. As a businessman who facilitated operations, he would have had knowledge of money laundering schemes, drug distribution networks, and the identities of key players. If he decided to cooperate with police, or if anyone suspected he might, that alone could have sealed his fate. The Hells Angels have a well-documented history of making problems disappear. Literally. People who become liabilities are dealt with efficiently and brutally. Bodies are disposed of in ways that make them nearly impossible to find. Rivers, forests, industrial sites, even pig farms have been used to hide evidence. If Louis Roy was murdered by the Hells Angels or their associates, his body could be anywhere. Quebec is vast, with endless wilderness, deep waters, and remote locations where remains could lie undiscovered for decades or forever. But there's another dimension to consider. The possibility that his death had nothing to do with the broader criminal organization and everything to do with something more personal, more immediate. A business deal that soured, money owed to the wrong person, a betrayal, real or perceived, within his smaller circle of associates. In this scenario, the timing of his disappearance during the biker war aftermath could be coincidental, or it could have provided convenient cover for someone with a more personal motive. When so many people are dying, one more body, one more disappearance, gets lost in the noise. The theories surrounding Louis Roy's disappearance can be grouped into several categories, each with varying degrees of plausibility and supporting evidence. Theory 1. Silenced by the Hells Angels. This is the theory most commonly held by investigators and those familiar with the case. The logic is straightforward. Louis Roy was deeply connected to an organization that was facing existential threat from law enforcement. Operation Springtime 2001 had decimated their ranks. Dozens of members were in jail facing long sentences. Some were cooperating. In this environment, anyone who possessed sensitive knowledge became a potential threat. The supporting evidence for this theory is primarily circumstantial but compelling. The timing of Roy's disappearance coincides with the aftermath of the massive police operation. Several other individuals connected to the Hells Angels disappeared or were murdered during the same period. The organization had both motive, preventing cooperation or testimony, and means, the infrastructure to carry out a professional disappearance. The counter-evidence is the absence of any indication that Roy was planning to cooperate with authorities. There's no record of him being approached by police as a potential witness. No evidence he had agreed to testify or provide information. If the Hells Angels killed him to prevent cooperation, they did so preemptively, based on suspicion rather than evidence. Some experts argue this actually makes the theory more plausible. In the paranoid atmosphere following Operation Springtime 2001, the Hells Angels might have been eliminating anyone they perceived as even potentially dangerous, not waiting for confirmation of betrayal. Theory 2. Personal dispute. The second major theory focuses on Louis Roy's business dealings and personal relationships. He was involved in multiple ventures, some legitimate, some not. Money was flowing through various channels. In these arrangements, disputes are common and can turn deadly. Perhaps Roy owed money to someone powerful. Perhaps a business deal went wrong and someone held him responsible. Perhaps there was a personal betrayal, a romantic involvement, a friendship violated, that led to violence. The evidence for this theory is largely speculative, based on the general reality that in Roy's world, personal and business disputes were often resolved with violence. Several people who knew him have suggested he was under some kind of pressure in the months before his disappearance, though the nature of that pressure remains undefined. The weakness of this theory is its vagueness. There's no specific dispute that's been identified, no particular person who emerges as an obvious suspect. It's a theory based on possibility rather than evidence. Theory 3. Voluntary disappearance. This theory suggests that Louis Roy, facing danger or legal problems, chose to vanish. That he staged his own disappearance and is living somewhere under a new identity. The appeal of this theory is that Roy had the resources and connections to pull it off. He had money, he knew people in various criminal networks, he could have secured false documents and established himself elsewhere. But the evidence against this theory is substantial. There's no financial trail suggesting he prepared for flight. His assets remained in place. His businesses weren't liquidated. If he planned to disappear, he did so with remarkable lack of preparation, leaving behind millions in assets and property. Furthermore, in the more than 20 years since his disappearance, there's been no confirmed sighting, no communication with family, no indication whatsoever that he's alive. While it's possible to disappear completely, it's extraordinarily difficult to maintain that disappearance for decades, especially when you're leaving behind significant wealth. Theory 4. Wrong place, wrong time. A less commonly discussed but still possible theory is that Roy's death had nothing to do with organized crime, business disputes, or personal vendettas. That he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps he witnessed something he shouldn't have. Perhaps he was mistaken for someone else. Perhaps random violence claimed him. This theory is the least supported by evidence and seems implausible given who Roy was and the circles he moved in. Random violence is always possible, but the complete disappearance, the absence of any evidence, suggests something more calculated. Among the most haunting aspects of Louis Roy's disappearance are the small details that never quite fit, the questions that remain unanswered no matter how many times the case is examined. Why was there no communication? In kidnapping cases, there's usually contact, ransom demands, proof of life, some attempt to negotiate. In Roy's case, there was nothing. Silence. Complete and absolute. This strongly suggests his death was immediate, that whoever took him had no intention of negotiation or return. Where was he going that day? Despite extensive investigation, police have never definitively established Roy's destination when he left his home. There's speculation he was meeting someone, but who? And why? The public record is silent on these questions. What did his associates know? Louis Roy moved in circles where people knew things they would never tell police. In the weeks and months after his disappearance, did anyone in these circles discuss what happened? Did rumors circulate? Did anyone let something slip? The police certainly pursued these avenues, but the code of silence in organized crime is nearly impenetrable. Was there a pattern? Several people connected to the Hells Angels and the biker war disappeared around the same time. Were these disappearances coordinated, part of a larger cleanup operation, or simply coincidental, separate acts of violence that happened to cluster in time? And perhaps most haunting, does anyone know where his body is? In cases of organized crime murders, there are sometimes people who know exactly what happened, where it happened, and where the body is buried or dumped. These people continue their lives, carrying this knowledge in silence. It's possible, likely, even, that someone knows where Louis Roy is. They've just never told anyone. The psychological impact on families of the disappeared is profound and unique. When someone you love simply vanishes, you're trapped in a terrible limbo. You can't grieve properly because there's no confirmation of death. You can't move forward because there's always the possibility, however small, that they might return. For Louis Roy's family, this burden has lasted over 2 decades. They've had to live with not knowing, with questions that have no answers, with a loss that can't be properly mourned because it can't be confirmed. But their situation is complicated by the reality of who Louis was and what he was involved in. There's grief, certainly, but it exists alongside an understanding that his lifestyle, his choices, his associations, made this outcome more likely than it would have been for someone living a conventional life. This doesn't make the loss easier. If anything, it makes it more complex. There's the natural human desire for closure, for answers, for a body to bury. But there's also the knowledge that seeking those answers too aggressively could be dangerous, that the people who might know what happened are not the kind of people you want to pressure. The media's role in Louis Roy's disappearance has been minimal compared to other missing person cases. This isn't because his case is less important, but because of who he was. The media typically focuses on innocent victims, people whose disappearances seem random, whose lives were conventional, whose families can appeal to public sympathy. Louis Roy's connections to organized crime meant his case was treated differently. News coverage was limited, factual, brief. There were no extended investigations by journalists, no documentaries, no sustained public interest. The general attitude seemed to be that this was the inevitable consequence of the life he chose. This disparity in media coverage reflects broader societal attitudes about victimhood and who deserves sympathy. But regardless of Louis Roy's choices or associations, his disappearance represents an unsolved crime, a family left without answers, and a failure of the justice system to provide resolution. The investigative techniques available in 2002 were significantly less advanced than those available today. DNA analysis, cell phone tracking, digital forensics, surveillance technology, all of these have evolved dramatically over the past 2 decades. If Louis Roy disappeared today, investigators would have tools that didn't exist in 2002. They could track his cell phone's last known location. They could analyze digital communications. They could employ advanced forensic techniques if any physical evidence was available. But in 2002, Many of these options were limited or unavailable. The investigation relied on traditional methods: interviews, financial analysis, physical evidence collection. And when those methods hit walls, when people wouldn't talk, when records revealed nothing conclusive, when no physical evidence could be found, the case stalled. There's always the possibility that modern techniques could be applied to cold evidence. If physical evidence was preserved properly, new DNA analysis might reveal something. If there are communications that weren't fully analyzed in 2002, modern digital forensics might extract information that was missed. But these possibilities depend on evidence existing in the first place. If Louis Roy was taken and killed efficiently, if his body was disposed of thoroughly, if the people involved left no trace, then even the most advanced modern techniques won't help. The investigation into Roy's disappearance remains officially open, classified as unsolved. But in practical terms, without new information, without someone coming forward, without some unexpected discovery, it's difficult to see how progress can be made. Police investigations depend on leads, on evidence, on witnesses. In Louis Roy's case, all three have been in short supply from the beginning. The people who might know something won't talk. The evidence, if it ever existed, is gone, and the leads that were pursued led nowhere definitive. Despite numerous people being arrested, charged, and convicted for crimes related to the biker war, despite some choosing to cooperate and testify, Roy's disappearance has never been explained. This silence is significant. It suggests either that very few people know what happened to him, or that those who do know are so deeply invested in keeping the secret that no incentive, reduced sentences, witness protection, immunity, has been enough to make them talk. In organized crime, certain secrets are kept absolutely. Murders of civilians, attacks that killed children. These sometimes lead to cooperation from those who want to distance themselves from the worst crimes. But internal murders, the elimination of people within the criminal world, are often kept silent. There's a code, and breaking it can have consequences even for those in prison or witness protection. If Louis Roy was killed by organized crime figures as part of internal operations, this code of silence might explain why his case has never been solved. For those who investigate cold cases, there are certain factors that determine whether a case might eventually be solved. The preservation of evidence, the possibility of witnesses coming forward, advances in forensic technology, changes in relationships that might make someone willing to talk decades after staying silent. Louis Roy's case has some of these factors working in its favor. Evidence was collected and presumably preserved. Technology has advanced. People age, their loyalties shift, their willingness to carry secrets diminishes. But it also has factors working against it. The passage of time degrades evidence, witnesses die, memories fade. And the kind of people who might know what happened to Roy are often the kind of people who take secrets to their graves. There have been no significant breaks in the case in recent years. No new witnesses. No deathbed confessions. No bodies discovered that might be Roy. The case exists in a state of suspended animation, officially open but practically dormant. For the investigators who work the case, this lack of resolution is frustrating. They developed theories, pursued leads, interviewed dozens of people. They believe they understood, broadly, what happened to Louis Roy. But understanding and proving are different things. And without proof, there can be no charges, no trial, no justice. The legal definition of murder doesn't require a body. People have been convicted of homicide without remains ever being found. But such convictions require substantial evidence, witnesses, confessions, physical proof that a crime occurred. In Roy's case, there's not enough. So the case remains unsolved. Not for lack of effort,
Not for lack of theories, but for lack of that crucial element that transforms suspicion into prosecution: evidence. When we talk about cold cases, about unsolved disappearances, it's easy to reduce them to mysteries, to puzzles that fascinate and intrigue us.
But behind every cold case is a real person, a life that was lived, relationships that were formed, a family that still wonders. Louis Roy was a complicated man. His choices led him into dangerous territory. His associations put him at risk. The life he lived made his disappearance, in some sense, an occupational hazard. But he was still human. He had people who cared about him. He had a childhood, dreams, fears, moments of happiness and pain. He existed as more than just a criminal associate, more than just a name in police files, about organized crime. His disappearance represents a failure of the justice system to provide answers, a failure of society to prevent the conditions that made such violence possible, a failure of the people who know what happened to find the courage or humanity to speak. 23 years is a long time to wait for answers. For most families, after 2 decades of silence, hope fades. They accept that they may never know, may never have closure, may carry these questions for the rest of their lives. Whether Louis Roy's family has reached this point of acceptance, we don't know. Their pain has been private, their loss undramatized by media attention. They've lived with his absence for more than half the time he was alive. The present state of the case can be summarized simply. Louis Roy disappeared on March 22, 2002. He has never been found. No one has been charged in connection with his disappearance. The investigation remains officially active, but has no active leads. If you ask Quebec police investigators about the case, they'll tell you they believe he was murdered. They'll tell you they have theories about who was involved and why. They'll tell you that without evidence, without witnesses, without a body, there's little they can do. If you ask people in the criminal underworld, those who were active in 2002, they'll tell you nothing. The code of silence remains intact. The question of whether justice can still be served after so much time is complicated. Legally, there's no statute of limitations on murder in Canada. If evidence emerged tomorrow that definitively proved Louis Roy was killed and identified his killers, charges could be filed, no matter how much time has passed. But practical justice is different from legal possibility. Witnesses might be dead. Evidence might be degraded beyond use. The people responsible might be beyond prosecution, protected by death or geography or legal barriers. Still, cold cases do get solved. Sometimes decades later. Sometimes because of new technology. Sometimes because someone decides, finally, to break their silence. Sometimes because of luck, a body discovered by accident, a deathbed confession, a piece of evidence found in an unexpected place. For Louis Roy's case to be solved, one of these things would need to happen. Someone would need to talk. Something would need to be found. Some connection would need to be made that has eluded investigators for 23 years. Is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? The odds diminish with each passing year. What would closure look like for a case like this? Different people would define it differently. For his family, closure might mean simply knowing what happened, having confirmation that he's dead, understanding the circumstances, being able to properly mourn. The where and how might matter less than the simple certainty of no longer having to wonder. For investigators, closure would mean solving the case, identifying those responsible, bringing charges if possible. It would mean transforming theory and suspicion into proven fact. For society, closure might mean acknowledging that this case, like so many others connected to organized crime, represents a failure to protect even those who made dangerous choices, a failure to provide answers even when the general outlines of what happened seem clear. But perhaps the truest form of closure would be simply remembering that Louis Roy existed, that he was a person, not just a statistic in Quebec's biker war casualties, that his disappearance, whatever the circumstances, represents an unsolved crime and an unfinished story. The nature of disappearances like his is that they create permanent voids. The person is gone, but they're not quite dead, not officially, not definitively. They exist in a state between life and death, present only as an absence, defined by their vanishing. For more than 2 decades, Louis Roy has existed in this liminal state. Gone but not buried, lost but not mourned, remembered but not found.
On quiet days in Saint-Sauveur, where Louis Roy once lived in a mansion filled with the rewards of his complicated life, nothing marks his disappearance. There's no memorial, no plaque, no indication that this beautiful town was the last place someone was seen before vanishing forever. Life continues. The world moved on. The biker war that formed the backdrop to his disappearance is now history, studied by journalists, reduced to timelines and statistics. But for those who knew him, for the family that lost him, for the investigators who couldn't solve his case, the questions remain. They're quieter now, less urgent after so many years, but they haven't disappeared. Where did he go when he left his home that March day? Who was he meeting? What happened in those final moments? Where is his body? Who knows the truth and has stayed silent all these years? Will anyone ever speak? These questions don't have answers. They hang in the air, suspended in the same limbo as Louis Roy himself, present but unreachable, real but unknowable. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing thing about cases like this isn't the violence, isn't the criminal connections, isn't even the failure to solve the crime. It's the silence, the absolute, enduring, impenetrable silence that follows certain disappearances. Someone knows. Maybe several people know. They wake up every day carrying this knowledge, living their lives while Louis Roy remains wherever they left him, unmourned, unfound, unreturned. That silence has lasted 23 years, it may last forever. Louis Roy disappeared on March 22, 2002. He was 47 years old. He left behind a family, businesses, property, and questions that have never been answered. More than 2 decades later, those questions remain. And somewhere, in a forest, in a river, buried in ground that will never be disturbed, Louis Roy remains too. Gone, but never quite forgotten. Not knowing what happened to someone you love is a unique kind of torture. It's a wound that can't heal because it can't close. The story has no ending, just an ellipsis that extends into infinity. For Louis Roy's family, this has been their reality for 23 years. No closure, no certainty, just absence and questions, and the terrible weight of not knowing. And unless someone breaks the silence, unless some piece of evidence emerges, unless luck or conscience intervenes, this will remain their reality forever. Louis Roy is gone. The truth about what happened to him remains somewhere in the darkness, known to a few, hidden from the rest. And in that darkness, the questions wait, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Who killed Louis Roy? Where is he now? Will we ever know? The silence offers no response. Only the echo of questions asked into a void that refuses to answer back.